Okay, we're live. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
I'm glad it's over. Yeah, it's a second day back to normality, so enjoying that for now.
Yeah. I actually like the short weeks. You know, there was like Shavuot, so it was like the before Shavuot you had like a long weekend, and then after Shavuot you had like a short week. I was thinking I can get used to this 3-day working week. It actually works for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the last period of time till the summer, I think, where we got one more month or two of normal life. Please God.
Who knows what normal is at this point anymore?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so I see people are coming in. So for the sake of the people that were on time, kudos to the people that are on time. I appreciate it very much. Let's just start. So good evening to everybody. My name is Miri Hoffman. I'm an elder law lawyer and I have a practice in Bet Shemesh. And my main focus is estate planning, which means dealing with wills, enduring power of attorneys, trusts, and a lot of estate planning and U.S. and Israeli taxation, especially for people who have both U.S. and Israeli citizenships. And working with this age group, mainly senior citizens, I've come across a lot of other professionals who also work in different things, mainly with, but not just, seniors. And I've decided to do these little talk sessions because I figured that, you know, their abilities can contribute to seniors and their families. And today we're going to be talking to Gadi Last, who is a specialist, investments, insurance, pensions. I think I got that right. Yep. Mainly for English speakers in Israel, and also the CEO of IAL Group. So Gadi, with no further ado, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mirit, and kol hakavod on these talks that you give for people. I'm honored to be on your roster. My name is Gadi Last. I made Aliyah about 14 and a half years ago. I'm married, +5, hence the grey hairs. And I've spent my career both in the UK, where I'm sure you can hear is where I made Aliyah from, and in Israel, working in the field of investments, finance. Most of my time in Israel was working with either Olim, English-speaking Olim, naturally, or foreign residents in their banking, on their investment, insurance, pensions. And I was working in one of the big Israeli banks for the first 8 years after Aliyah, and about 5.5 years ago, I left and I set up my own practice, the IAL Group, to help English speakers in Israel with their insurance, their investments, and their pensions. Because there's just, as you all know, so much there that people just don't understand, stuff that I didn't understand until I started dealing with it. And it's just really important. It's important stuff, and sometimes it can be, you know, life-changing stuff as well. So it's really, really an important topic. So that's me in a nutshell.
100%. It's like a black hole for most people, including myself. And it is a very important topic and really shouldn't be ignored. So I'm very happy you're here discussing it with us. So let's start. So if somebody has assets abroad and in Israel, what do you think? What is the best way to manage these assets?
Right. I mean, there's no obviously black and white answer. And at the end of the day, it's very cliched, but every situation is different. One thing I find, though, that people who make Aliyah to Israel aren't always aware of is that there are people or companies who can manage assets in both places. Look, it's not critical to have one person doing everything, but it can have advantages. Often, you know, I see this all the time. People make Aliyah from England or America. They have their financial advisor, they have their IFA, and they've been working with them. And you know, sometimes they're happy with them, and if they're happy and things work, I normally say my philosophy generally is, if it works, don't break it. Okay, if it's kind of I'm not sure if that's the expression, but if it ain't broken, don't fix it, something like that.
Right.
But, you know, so if that's the case, that's, you know, you have whoever's managing your assets for you overseas. You have someone in Israel managing assets as well. It can work. It can work. Often, though, there are plenty of advantages of having kind of someone look over both sides. And also what a lot of people tend to do, not immediately after Aliyah, but kind of after they've been here a year, 2 years, 3 years, they're kind of starting to feel more comfortable in shekel. They're starting to be turning into a nervous wreck, looking at the exchange rate every day, and I need to send over this and that, to pay for my gas. And they kind of start to think about moving more of their assets over to Israel. And then, having someone here who knows the system is important, and having someone who can kind of talk to their overseas advisor, or at least understand where they're coming from, is also important. Someone who understands what a 401k is, what a Roth IRA, what an ISA in the UK is. It can have a lot of advantages. Also when managing, I kind of tell people who I'm meeting before they make Aliyah, to always before they come, make sure they kind of set things up overseas as best as they can. You know what I mean? If you haven't sold your home, or you have investment real estate back home from the country from where you made Aliyah, make sure things are in place so that it's easy for you to manage. You have the right people there, who can help you now that you're not living where you used to live. If you can simplify structures, tax structures, trust structures, again, it's not always possible. That it depends on the situation. But the simpler you can leave it for yourself, the better. That's just for ease of your own ease of management, and also for the fact that what a lot of people end up doing is that they do eventually start moving all of their assets over to Israel. And if you're having to deal with a property owned by a company which is 25% owned by your brother and your sister and you need to sell that, and your bank account in England, you need to transfer over here, you need to show the Israeli bank, where the money came from, it can get complicated. So the simpler things are, the better. That's I think an important piece of advice that I give people.
No, that's good advice. There's something I wanted you to just touch on, like for a few seconds, regarding PFIX, because I know a lot of people, especially Americans, that's a big issue, the PFIX.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's a big issue. For anyone who's listening and doesn't know what a PFIC is, in a nutshell, basically, if you're a US citizen, then the American tax regime has quite onerous tax reporting requirements and quite penal tax rates if you invest in certain things, which happen to be the most common and sensible things to invest in: ETFs, funds, Kupot Gemel, Kranot Ishtalmut if you're a freelancer, etc., outside of the States. So most Americans tend to avoid these kind of investments, which means for the Americans moving to Israel, the question about moving assets over to Israel has that extra kind of layer, because you can move assets to Israel. The Israeli banks, once you're living here, are fine. You sign a W-9 and it's okay. The problem is on the US side, and you may have more. You may have more options leaving your money in the States than bringing them over here. Again, not necessarily, but it depends on the advisor you work with. It depends on the CPA, the US CPA that you work with. But it's good that you brought up the point. It is important, and it's definitely a consideration when thinking about how much money to move over, whether to move over. A lot of Americans until now have been sending money, let's say savings in Israel, back to the States, which is becoming more and more difficult, as anyone who's American probably knows. A lot of the brokerage companies are closing accounts there. It's a subject for a whole different talk. But yeah, it's definitely something to take into account.
Okay. So I think you actually touched on this question about, should I keep my assets overseas? Should I keep them overseas, or should I bring them all to Israel? I know from my point of view that when I prepare wills, if they have assets in America, then there's the question, should I prepare 2 wills? Should I prepare 1 will? And then it gets a little bit complicated. And then it's the question what they have and how structured it is, etc. So I'm assuming your answer would be just as complicated.
So, I mean, again, it depends on the situation, and it doesn't have to be always as complicated as people think. There are a couple of things actually that I will add to what you're right. We did start touching upon it previously, but there's a few things I just know from people that I speak to and advise. I mean, first of all, there's obviously the 10-year tax break. okay, which is worth, which again, if you're American, you have to pay your taxes in the States anyway. It's not as useful necessarily for most things, but if you're not American and you're making Aliyah, then it's obviously a very useful tax break. So the first there's a major misnomer, and that is that people are told mistakenly, or they think and that is you can only benefit from the 10-year tax break if you leave the money outside of Israel. And that's actually not true. You can bring your money to Israel. You have to invest it in not in shekel. If you buy Israeli company stock or bonds or Israeli funds in shekel, then you don't get the 10-year tax break. But if you invest in, and I have a lot of clients who do this, who you keep your money in dollars, in pounds, in euros. Less people are keeping it in pounds after the last few years, but you keep it in the foreign currency. And you have it managed here in Israel through your Israeli brokerage account, through a wealth manager, through whoever, you still get the 10-year tax break. And that's a very important point, because just because of ease of ease of living, your money's here. You don't have to call up a bank overseas, and the closed bank holidays, you can't get hold of them. It's et cetera, et cetera. The money's here. The money's in your bank account. Where not that dealing with Israeli banks is the easiest thing in the world. Sometimes it's actually easier to deal with a foreign bank bringing money over to Israel. But theoretically, it's often much more convenient. That's A. B, what I often advise when I'm looking at, say, a portfolio of an oleh, and we're thinking about the proportions, what to leave in shekel, what to have in shekel, what to have in foreign currency. Even this is just my kind of philosophy. It's how I do things. It doesn't, not everyone necessarily agrees, but once you're living in Israel, I think there is a logic in having a portion of the assets in shekel, even if you're not going to get the 10-year tax break. You're living here, your expenses are here. You're starting to just your life is here. So that's why it's also something to take into account when thinking about bringing money over. If you do want to have money in shekel, just because you just want to, for convenience sake, for your lifestyle or for whatever, then obviously you need to bring that over to Israel to have that. So that's the other thing that I wanted to add as well.
Okay. So let's move on to a different thing. What regarding insurance for 55 plus or 65 plus, and touch also on health insurance. What things should we be looking at when we're looking at our insurance at that age?
Right. So it's a good question, and the 55 plus is kind of where, people, you don't have to look at your insurance every day, but I always tell people that it's not something you look at every week, but it's worth every year or two kind of just going over and making sure things are in order. As you start to get older, I would say 50, 55, 60 is kind of the critical age where things like life insurance in particular starts to get really expensive on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have people generally have less and less of a dependence, or people who are dependent on them financially. The kids he's got married and earning a living, and parents help their kids, and we all know what's out there, what the reality is. But
but it's different still.
It's different. Life insurance, the way I view life insurance, because I view everything through a financial protection kind of prism, is that it's, if God forbid the person bringing in the income from tomorrow is not bringing in the income, for how long do you want does the person who's passed away, do they want their family not to suffer at least from a financial point of view? Right? There are plans. The kids, there's trips, there's bar mitzvahs, there's weddings, there's helping the kids buy their property. There's all kinds of things that a person's planned for, and all of a sudden, the income's not there. So that's kind of how I plan life insurance, and that's the golden question: how much life insurance is the right amount? How much is too much? Again, there's no right or wrong answer, but think about it. If someone is bringing in 200,000 shekel a year, how many years do you want your family, not from a financial point of view at least, and that sounds horrible, but we're talking finance, how many years do you want them not to feel the financial loss? If it's 10 years because your kids are almost out of the house and married or whatever, then 200,000 shekel a year times 10, 2 million shekel. When the kids are younger, there's more years of dependency, that's, then it's more critical to have higher amounts. Right. Also, while you're building assets, but once 55, 60, 65, there might be other assets, there might be investment properties. It really depends on the financial situation of the family and the dependents. So that's I think the most important thing from an insurance point of view to look at and to think about when you reach that age. How much life insurance do you have? Is it enough? Obviously, is it too much? How much is it costing you? And often, you can do the same amount and just get a cheaper policy as well, so you end up paying less and having the same amount. That's the kind of thing to think about. And where I would tend to kind of, let's say, a person reduces the amount of life insurance or goes to a cheaper company, and they're now saving X amount of shekel a month. With that X amount of shekel, either you can pocket it, or you take a look. Anyway, you take a look at the health insurance situation as well. So on the other hand, once you get to that age, that's when the health insurance can often come into play more. There are more health issues. You want to make sure that you have, the appropriate cover, that you want. And it's not a matter with health insurance whereby the younger you start, the cheaper it is, because it goes up with age. It doesn't, and you join in wherever. But the healthier you are when you go in, the better, because with private health insurance, any pre-existing conditions are excluded. So that's why that's a critical age where I would say you kind of look at the swing from life to health insurance. I mean, someone who has full health insurance, it's fine, it's irrelevant. It's just a matter of saving money or putting those funds to better use. But those are the two main things I would say. The other thing is long-term care insurance. First of all, just a lot of people, it's interesting, a lot of people think that when they join the Kupat Cholim, when they join the Maccabi Sheli or Mu'chedet, the top level, they automatically think that they have the CUD insurance, the long-term care insurance. They don't. You don't. So make sure you have that. You do it through your Kupat Cholim, not through an insurance broker. It's partial cover. Okay, it pays out about 4,000 to 5,000 shekel a month for 5 years, which covers a part of long-term care costs. But it's there and it's kind of cheap for what it is. So it's pretty much a no-brainer to go out and do that. And the other point I would just finish off by saying on long-term care insurance is that if you have an old policy, because they don't offer private long-term care insurance policies anymore. They might start in the future. They were thinking about before Corona, but Corona put it on hold. And if you have an old policy, just hold on to it as hard as you can, because it's they don't exist anymore. And if you're looking to raise some cash or to reduce your insurance costs, your old private long-term care insurance policy should be the last place, in my opinion, to raise that cash from, because they're good policies. They don't exist anymore. And by the way, you should know, if you stop paying for them after a amount of time that you paid for them, they actually still retain their value or part of their value. Okay, so again, I don't want to get into too technical on it, but
that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's interesting news.
Yeah. Listen, there's a reason why the insurance policy companies stopped offering them. They were good policies, and the insurance companies saw a fraction of cash they were going to start paying out in the future. So they're like, well, this is not a feasible model anymore. So they've stopped it. Even if new private policies come out, which I imagine they might, as I said, they were definitely talking about it, they're not going to have the same characteristics as the old ones, meaning you fix your price at the age that you go in, and they have this residual value, even if you stop paying and then God forbid, the person needs to claim on the policy down the line, to have that kind of residual value.
100%. I think, as you said, they're one of the most important policies because you grow. The age expectancy is getting higher, but it doesn't mean that you live healthy throughout that whole entire life. And you might well need to use Dafka from all the insurances that you're buying, Dafka that one. So
right, absolutely. Also because as medical technology gets better, the average age that people are living in a CUD state, in a long-term care state, is also going up. So that's why, the Kupot Cholim policies they stop paying out after 5 years. On average, a year ago, the last time the study came out, on average, long-term care patients are living for 8 years after they become a long-term care patient. So it's all part of financial planning and making sure you have from where to take money if, God forbid, things like
Yeah,
that.
it's very important. It's very important to make sure you have that. What about pension accounts and hishtalmut or kupot gemel savings? What kind of, tips or important advice do you think you can give here?
Right. So look, so when it comes to retirement savings, there's a couple of very important points. And actually, ironically, the younger one is when they deal with these points, the better it is, because you have longer till retirement to enjoy the benefits of. But having said that, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like it's you can better your situation however old one is, or however close to retirement one is. The first thing I would say is who's managing your pension or your Hishdalmut. Okay, there's the performance figures are public information. Obviously, future performance is no guarantee of past performance, but there tend to be companies who outperform long term and some who underperform long term. Why is that important for your pension? Very simply, how does it work? How does the pension work? A man gets to the age of 67, a woman to the age of 62 or 64, and they say, okay, time for me to retire. They go to the pension company and they say, I want to retire. This is what I've got, how much money are you going to give me every month? Very simply, it's a function of how much you've saved up divided by the life expectancy. So the more you've saved up, the more you're going to have every month for the rest of your life. So even when I'm talking to people who are, let's say, in their 40s and they still have 20, 25 years to save, sometimes the difference of a 1% performance a year can mean an extra 3,000 or 4,000 shekel a month in their pension. Again, the closer you are to retirement, the less. But even still, if you can make a decision, if you can do almost nothing and have an extra 200, 500, 1,000 shekel a month every month for the rest of your life, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do it? There's no guarantee, etc. But do you know what I mean? It's still worth having a good look. So that's who's managing it. Also very important, how is it being invested? This is something which unfortunately most Israelis, let alone Olim, just don't deal with. Typically what will happen is someone will go to work for a company, the company will bring in their broker doesn't have time to sit and think about things. He wants you to sign and he wants to get out. And which means the majority of people in Israel are in what they call the default investment track, which for many people, especially Olim, and I've noticed with Americans as well, the Americans have come with a good kind of investment education in terms of they're willing to take on risk. They know that the right amount of stocks is critical for their performance, and in Israel it's much more conservative. The default is more conservative, and it's so important to look at how the money is invested, because that is, again, going back to what we said about the extra performance. Forget who's managing it, even if you have the worst manager, but the investment track is better. That is going to bring you most of your extra performance and bring you extra money when you retire. So is your money invested right? If you still have a decent amount of time before retirement, maybe you should be increasing the risk and then looking a few years before retirement, 5 years, to reducing that risk. Obviously, vice versa works as well. If someone who's 65 and 20 years ago put all of their pension into stocks and they're about to retire, or retiring in a year or two, you want to make sure that you reduce that risk, because there could be a crash. Sod's law. A few months before you retire, there's a market crash, and now you're retiring, so you don't have time to make up that loss. So it's very, very important to look at how your money is invested. Fees are also important. Everyone's always going about fees, and you see adverts and this and the regulator fees. Fees are important, and they will also, any money you're not paying to the pension company, you're pocketing yourself. So it's also important to keep on top of fees. The last thing I would say on pensions is also there are, if anyone who's been in Israel for a while, a number of years, at least 10 years, it could be that they have old pension plans that don't exist anymore and have certain benefits which you can't get. Meaning, just before you make any major changes or cancel old plans and move to new plans, make sure you're doing it with your eyes open and you know what you're doing. Because again, that can also have a big effect.
Right. What about kupot gemel? Is there anything special about kupot gemel? Kalnot Ishtalmut and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's the same idea. I mean, Kupat Gimel and Keren Ishtalmut. Kupat Gimel is essentially also it's a pension vehicle, just without the insurance parts. Keren Ishtalmut is also kind of under that umbrella of retirement savings. I mean, it's not really retirement savings. After 6 years, you can take the money out. But there again, a lot of people, what they do, especially Olim who've made Aliyah, not at the beginning of their working life, and they need to kind of save up as much as they can for retirement. They're relying on their Keren Ishtalmut to add to their kind of overall pension pot and take a monthly pension from. So that's also who's managing it, what fee are you paying, and how is it invested. Sometimes you also have come across cases where a person's retired and they actually view their pension fund or more commonly their Kupat Gimel or Keren Ishtalmut as what they're going to bequeath to the next generation. They don't need it. They're living on what they have. So they might be 75, 80 years old, let's say, who normally you'd say you want to go low risk, but in theory, it's not necessarily as short a time horizon as you might have thought originally. So it's important, again, each case is different and each person's situation is different. It's important to kind of make sure that things are set up for you according to what you want and what's right for you, and not just to take the regular standard advice.
Okay. What about borrowing money at this age? A lot of people, might think I need to borrow money for something big, but then they're worried because they're older. How does it work? What should they do?
Right. So right. I mean, there are a couple of ways which aren't so commonly known, which you can borrow at any age. Obviously, when people think borrowing, they think mortgage, and banks don't like to lend beyond the age of 75. So that's for many people, especially retirees, let's say, who aren't earning the income, let's say, and their additional income is going down, and the monthly repayment will be very high because it's a short time horizon. Mortgages aren't necessarily the right way to do it. So there's two options. One, which don't necessarily exactly replace a mortgage, but can definitely be useful and are very useful, and I use them all the time. A is that you can borrow against your pension fund, your Keren Ishtalmut and Kupat Gimel. Okay, it's the amounts you can borrow are, depending on whether the money is liquid or not. Pension funds obviously aren't liquid until you retire, so you can borrow, let's say, 30% of what you have. On a Keren Ishtalmut, which is liquid, meaning you could withdraw it if you want. You can borrow between 70 and 80%. And it's a relatively quick way of getting a loan. The whole credit process is much easier than doing it with a bank. It's a short form. It's they can often have the money in your account within a couple of weeks. They're very flexible as well in terms of your repayments. You can either have the regular repayments of capital plus interest. You can also have interest only, and in some cases you can even have balloon. It's kind of like basically pay nothing until the end, right?
Right.
You can do 7 years. So kind of, you know what I mean? So as opposed to a mortgage, which is 20, 25 years. So your monthly repayment might actually be, you have to make sure that it works for you. But the interest rate is also very low. It's usually prime, prime minus, prime plus a little bit. Prime in today is 1.6%. It's a very, if you need short-term money, or if you need, you want to give your kids 100, 200,000 shekel, it's a really great way to do it. The other thing I would say for Americans is that, and even for non-Americans, but particularly for Americans, because as we discussed earlier, finding ways to invest tax efficiently or efficiently bichlal is not always easy. And the best way, the Keren Ishtalmut is really pretty much the best savings vehicle out there. And instead of taking the money out, because you're not going to be able to put that money back in, you can put new money in. You can't put back the old money. Let's say if you take it out, you buy, you invest, you sell it, and you want to put the money back in. You can't do that. So instead of taking the money out, often the advice is, again, assuming the person can afford the monthly repayments and assume there's somewhere where they're going to have to be able to pay, instead of taking the money out, to borrow against the Keren Ishtalmut. And again, everyone has, they're going to pay it back from wherever they want. Worst comes to worst, you just use the money in the Keren Ishtalmut to pay it back. But
right.
It's very
for some people who didn't know that this option exists, so now they do, and it's a good option for a lot of
Yeah, no, I've met people who've taken the money and then why did I do that? Listen, whatever, it is what it is, but it's definitely worth knowing. That's the first thing. The second thing is what's even less known is that there is one company in Israel, one of the insurance companies, potentially a second, may have just joined the market, but who offer what they call kind of reverse mortgages, so equity release, something which is very popular in overseas, in the States, in England.
Right.
You can think about it with, thank God, depending if you're looking to buy or if you already own, property prices in Israel have gone up a ton over the years. So you have situations like in other markets. When I was in England, even it was already like that. You'd have someone who owns a 4-bedroom apartment in Rishon LeZion, in Holon. I'm not talking about Rehavia and mid-central Tel Aviv. And suddenly it's worth 4 million shekel. They now want to. They don't have a mortgage, okay, and they want to release equity for whatever, to invest, not so much to invest in theory. Although you've got to be quite a gutsy person, in my opinion, to borrow against your property to invest. But you want to
really just to give the kids, maybe to give the kids.
Yeah, exactly. They want to help their kids put a down payment on their place, or whatever it is. So you basically release equity from the home, and here too also it's very flexible, meaning you don't even have to pay anything back. You can obviously pay capital and interest back. You can pay interest back, or you can pay nothing back. And when the person leaves the property, either they leave this world or they sell or whatever, only then does the loan have to be paid back. Which again, each situation is unique, but it's an option which exists out there. And frankly, I've asked people in the industry why it's so not a common thing here, and no one really gave me a good answer, because in England and in America and other countries, it's so common, these type of credit facilities. But for whatever reason here it's not so common. But there is one, potentially two companies here which do that.
That's very important, actually. That's very important to know. Okay, we're nearly done, but I do want to touch on a very important topic about what should people do if they start downsizing, because the nest is empty. They don't need the big house anymore. They've sold the big house. They bought a smaller apartment. Now they have all this money. What would you advise them to do with the money? Should they invest it? How should they invest it? What should they do with it?
Right. Yeah, it's also something come across all the time, and it's interesting because often, but people have sold their main home, and all of a sudden they have amounts in their account which they are not used to having, and it can be quite scary. It's obviously nice to have, but it's also like I've never had to think about these kind of amounts and what to do with them. So obviously, answer one is yes, look to invest in something. Kind of don't leave the money. And to be fair, the low interest rates that we've had in the world for so many years has made people much more antsy or kind of willing to invest. People don't like seeing large amounts of cash in their account because they don't get anything for it.
Right.
So and it's definitely that's the right thing to do. Do something with it and invest it. If you may need that money for something. Okay, if someone's moving to somewhere else, or their kids are going to need it, or they have a use for it, then you invest in something which the time horizon matches what you're going to need the money for. If it's money that you may or may not need, it's just there to grow and to be given over to the next generation, then we think about it in a different way. But definitely don't leave it in cash in the bank. Definitely think about doing something with it. There's all kinds of things you can do. There's a small investment property. There's a stock portfolio, bond portfolio, lending platform. Again, it's not the forum to now go through all the options, but there are definitely things that are out there that you should be doing. Don't leave it in cash in the bank account.
Okay, well that's important. Don't leave it in cash in the bank account. Okay, well, time flew. And you got a lot of information, and I wanted to thank you very, very much for talking with me.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And
hope some of the information is helpful to the listeners.
I'm sure it's very helpful to a lot of people. Your number is on the screen. If anybody has any questions, they're more than welcome to contact Gadi or myself, or to write comments at the bottom of this session, and then we'll try and reply as soon as we can. And that's it for tonight. So thank you very much for joining us all, and I will see you next week. So have a good night.
Take care. Good night, everybody.